Welcome to another Camera Club of Brevard webinar. I hope everyone continues to stay healthy and are doing well tonight. Thanks for participating in this Zoom webinar tonight. Looks like we have about 25 participants, so that's great. And this is the fourth webinar in a series on photography composition tools and concepts. And we are on a quest to improve our photography by seeing and composing more creatively. That's what we've been talking about. And the good news is that seeing creatively is a learned talent. It takes some practice. But anyone can create remarkable images. And we don't often think of this, but at least I haven't thought of this, but photography is an artistic skill in the same way music might be, for instance. With very few exceptions, people don't just sit down and play the guitar or the piano, for instance. You know, they first have to study the basics of musical notes and techniques. Then they practice many hours to become skilled in the musical arts. I know I found that to be true for myself anyway. And the same can be said for photography. So creative images come from understanding a few basics of composition and camera skills. And then just as in musical arts, practice makes perfect. So competition or composition is one of those fundamentals to learn and practice for remarkable images. And those of you that have attended our prior webinars know that we have summarized the definition for composition as how we frame our subject in our image and how we decide what to include, and probably more important, what to exclude from our photograph. And remember, our goal for composition is to encourage viewers to linger a long time in our image. So let's look at an important compositional tool or element that might help us engage our viewers. In these series of webinars, we've been breaking down a few key components of composition, and we've discussed the rule of thirds, negative space, and secondary frames. And if you missed any of the prior webinars, they're recorded and available for viewing, and you can check out your Camera Club of Brevard email updates for all the details on how to play them back. But tonight, let's explore some practical ways we might incorporate one of the most important elements in photographic art, and that is lines. Next week in our final session, at least in this series, we'll unpack shapes and how they might impact our compositions. So lines, everywhere lines. They are effective for many reasons. They help create a sense of depth. They can evoke mood and feelings, as we'll discuss, and they can direct your viewer's eye through an image, so-called leading lines. And they can even be the main subject of your composition. So while visual artists can create lines with their pencils or paintbrushes, or in this day and age, software, photographers must first find them and then work them into the composition. Photographers must derive lines from one of three fundamental sources. We can include physical objects in our composition that graphically appear as lines, or we can find and include the juxtaposition of contrasting tones or colors and textures that also appear as lines, or we can impose or compose implied lines or conceptual lines that are not really represented graphically at all. And we'll talk more about that. So let's review all three of these sources of lines in a lot greater detail. So one way photographers can derive lines is from observing and including physical objects that graphically appear as lines. In this image, lines are formed from rows of one of my favorite plants. Anyone else's favorite plant? Of course, my camera position was key to deriving these lines seen in the physical rows of the grapevines, and the lines add some dynamics to this Oregon landscape, at least in my opinion they do. What do you think? So in this image, choosing to include the poles of the pier adds vertical and diagonal lines to our composition. And we'll talk more about how this might impact the feelings and how our viewers may deal with these lines in the composition. Another example where people are the physical objects that form the vertical lines in our composition. And here, a river and its banks form these curved graphical lines in our composition that your viewers will enjoy viewing. So all of these are examples of physical objects that form the lines in the composition. Another way photographers can derive lines is from observing and including the juxtaposition of conceptual elements such as contrasting tones or colors or textures, as can be seen in this image. Sunbeams certainly form these lines of contrasting tones and colors that create interesting lines in our composition. And we can derive lines from observing and including contrasting colors and tones of a shoreline, for instance. And the third way we can derive lines is that photographers can observe and include implied lines or conceptual lines that are not represented graphically. And we will discuss implied lines in a little greater detail in a few minutes, but they can be formed by two or more objects aligned in a row, as in this photo. Your mind's eye forms a diagonal line as you connect the dots between the planes. That is, airplanes. Implied lines can also be created by a person looking at an object. After all, we are human beings, and we love to look at what others are looking at. That's what goes on today in social media in spades. An implied line is formed by our mind's eye from the girl's eyes to her phone in this image. Of course, there are several other physical objects in this image as well that form lines. So in summary, unlike visual artists who draw or paint, photographers must derive lines from one of three fundamental sources. We can derive them from physical objects, which graphically appear as lines, such as trees, as we saw grapevines, or rails or poles or rivers, or even people can form lines. Or the juxtaposition of contrasting tones, colors, or textures, such as shadows or shorelines or stripes or sunbeams, can all be a source of lines. And then last but not least, we have implied lines or conceptual lines that are not represented graphically, but they can be formed by two or more objects aligned in a row, or by a person looking at an object, or gestures or signs or shapes pointing to an object. So now that we have a better understanding of how we might derive lines, let's explore 5 types of lines that that have an impact on our composition. And the first up is horizontal lines. Some authors suggest that horizontal lines is the baseline in composition. And there is a definite horizontal dynamic to the way we see the world. And our eyes usually scan from side to side, so it's probably not surprising that horizontal lines feel the most comfortable to us. After all, the horizon is our fundamental reference that supports us here on Earth. So horizontal lines convey stability, calm, restfulness, and tranquility. And if we associate our composition with the actual horizon, we can suggest that there's a distance or breadth as can be seen in this image. Note the horizontal lines of the waves and shorelines, as well as the actual horizon that is included in this image. Fitting for a practitioner of yoga, don't you think? Hopefully you can feel the tranquility here. Of course, next up is vertical lines. A vertical line tends to evoke feelings of strength and stability. Think about where you see vertical lines. It's a main component of a tree or a building column and a human form, and we associate this with stability and strength. If we incorporate a single vertical line in our composition, this can convey a sense of solidarity as well. Several vertical forms are often associated with a barrier. You can think like the fence post or fences. They add some tension to the scene. And this is probably a good place to say that let's be aware of that vertical and horizontal lines in a photograph are compared by our eyes with the frame edges. So for better or worse, even the slightest discrepancy is immediately noticed by your viewers. And probably especially true of the horizon line. One of the most distracting things your viewers will see in a photograph is a horizon line that's not straight. Unless, of course, it is obvious that the intent of the photographer was to tilt the camera. A slanted horizon can become quite the distraction. So diagonal lines, of all the lines, diagonals convey the most dynamics to our image frame. They bring action, motion, and energy because they represent unresolved tension. A diagonal is in an unstable position, and it's in the process of falling. They have a remarkable power to grab your viewer's attention because of this unstable position that they are in your frame. What's more, converging horizontal or vertical lines become diagonal that convey a sense of depth and distance, as well as motion and energy. From a practical standpoint, a horizontal or vertical line can be transformed into a diagonal just by tilting our camera or changing our point of view. The resulting diagonal will introduce dynamics of action into our composition. I often do this when I photograph signs. The resulting image will put some dynamics in your slideshows, if you have signs in your slideshows, or on your social media posts for that matter. But here's an example of that, where just tilting the camera added some dynamics to the image by making all these lines here on a diagonal. So as we said, diagonals convey the most dynamics in our image frame, and take a look at these two similar images. The ocean view on the top is shot straight on. It's composed with several horizontal lines formed by the horizon and the contrasting tones and colors of the waves and shorelines. Now look at the bottom image. By changing our point of view, diagonal lines are formed in the waves and surf line. And do you find the image composed with the horizontal lines more calming and serene? How about the image composed with the diagonal surf line? Do you find it conveys more energy and motion? What do you think? And which image is better? You may have a favorite, but I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. As in all art, the better image depends on the intent of the artist. And of course, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Another type of line is curves. Unique to the curve line is that it contains a progressive change in direction and avoids direct comparison to the horizontal and vertical edges of the image frame. Curves give the feeling of being gentle and smooth and flowing and graceful and elegant. Curves are also interesting to most people, especially when they undulate. Curves are harder to introduce in a composition than diagonals because they must be introduced by including elements with real curves. So curves can also be introduced by photographing physical objects, as well as capturing the contrasting tones of colors of things like shorelines and shadows. So one last type of line we can implement is implied lines. As I said earlier, implied lines are conceptual and not represented graphically. Instead, a line is represented in one of two principal ways. First, lines can be implied by the alignment of two or more elements in the image frame. An example is in this photo of stones in the pavement, aligned along an implied diagonal line. And as artists, we often have some control over whether we will include a horizontal, vertical, or diagonal implied line just by the camera position or the tilt of our camera. And remember, horizontal lines convey stability, calm, restfulness, and tranquility. Think about the horizon. We associate vertical lines with stability and strength. Think about a building column. And if several vertical lines are formed, it can possibly convey some sort of tension. Think about a fence, for instance. And of course, diagonal lines bring action, motion, and energy because they represent this unstable position, like they're almost ready to fall over. The second way to imply a line may be the most valuable that can be used in designing a composition, at least in my opinion. We know a person looking at something will form a strong implied line. Our viewers were certainly going to want to follow. And it is simply normal curiosity to look where the eyes are looking. Whenever these eye lines occur, they carry significant importance in the composition of the image. If your subject's eye line is looking outside the image frame, our viewer will wonder, what the heck are they looking at? This creates some sense of mystery in our viewer's mind. And remember, we want them to linger there and think for a minute, because that's one of the primary purposes of our composition. When photographing a couple or group, experiment with asking one person to look at the other. I think it makes a more casual portrait, but it also adds some interest. Your viewers will follow the eye line and maybe linger a little longer in your image than a more formal, straightforward portrait. Which person does your eye linger a little longer on when you look at each of these images? For me, it depends on the eye lines. I spend more time looking at the person being looked at. What do you think? Implied lines can also be formed by gestures and signs and shapes pointing to an object or pointing in a direction. In this case, the arrow was composed within the frame, forming a line along the path our biker is going to take to win this race. So it kind of takes the viewer on down the path, if you will, with that arrow also composed in the image. Of course, you could use this same concept with an arrow or a sign or a gesture or someone else pointing to a primary subject as well. So we discussed different types of lines and how they impact mood and feeling of our photographic art. However, lines may have the most compositional power when they're used to direct our viewers' attention. We call these types of lines, of course, leading lines. A leading line that directs our viewer's eye to the specific subject or object within the frame may make that part of the image stand out. If our leading line points beyond the image frame, we tend to create a sense of mystery to our viewer's mind. However, more often, we'll use leading lines to point directly to our main subject. Although, like all compositional tools and techniques, there are no hard rules. Effective leading lines terminate at our main subject instead of continuing, which will direct our viewers' attention beyond the primary point of interest. When it comes to leading lines, there's probably only one important question we need to ask ourselves. Where do I want my leading lines to direct my viewer's eye? If they confuse or point to an undesired place, we need to recompose our image. Pretty simple. Of course, leading lines can't be used in every image we make, but they can make a significant impact on what I'll call the interestingness, it's an invented word, of our images. Finding leading lines is not usually easy. However, changing our point of view of the scene can be an effective way to uncover them. Move closer, move farther away, get down low, look up, or get up high and look down. Exploring the scene in this way uncovers hidden leading lines that can turn an ordinary good photo into a remarkable one. So we've reviewed several sources and types of lines we can incorporate in our photo compositions. We discussed how certain types of lines can impact emotions and feelings. We've seen how they can help create a sense of depth. We've also discussed how leading lines can guide viewers through our image. And we've learned that lines can even be interesting as our main subject of our composition. Featuring lines is just another opportunity to make our photography significantly more remarkable and interesting. And hopefully you now have some ideas to experiment with, but use your imagination and be open to opportunities to combine the use of lines with other composing tools and techniques we've discussed. Playing with the possibilities can be the difference between an ordinary good image and an extraordinary one. So have fun with lines in your compositions. I hope you practice and experiment with the many opportunities we've discussed and make good use of all the powerful compositional tools we reviewed. We got one more to review next week, shapes. And thanks again for attending our Camera Club Brevard Zoom webinars. I hope to see you at our final webinar in this series. As always, keep shooting, and may only the most remarkable